Well, hi everyone. Good evening and welcome to this Taught Us Thinking about marriage. Now, some of you who've joined this evening, this might be your first Taught Us Thinking. I know I'm recognising lots of names in the chat. Some of you have been to many of these things. As a lesbian feminist who was married to a man for 10 years, I don't know if that makes me the best qualified person to conduct this conversation or the absolute worst. Either way, I'm doing it. So maybe the only way to find out is to kind of see how we go. I really do want to hear from you and your experiences, if you're willing to share them, your thoughts, your perspectives. Furiously disagree with me, ferociously agree with me, whatever you feel. I think this evening the point is we're going to try and be as honest and transparent and as vulnerable perhaps as we can be to talk about something which is a really big deal, I think. And I know that our framing of this conversation was a bit facetious about the Bezoses and the Gateses and you, because clearly two separations of big power couples over there in America doesn't really mean much inside our little lives. But this is a big conversation, and it's a really big part of who we are and how we live and how we relate to one another. And so I'm keen to get stuck into it, because the last year has been tough on relationships. It's of course been really tough on people who live alone, but it's been tough on relationships too. And my colleague Ellen Halliday, who is marshalling the chat, has put together those brilliant slides with some really interesting data points in there. And I don't think we could find in our work looking at the data sort of conclusive hard numbers to suggest that indeed marriage, it's on its way out. Quite the opposite. If anything, it would seem that people are choosing to get married and divorce rates are going down, although the views of the page on the Citizens Advice Bureau, which is called Getting a Divorce, shot up during lockdown. We're here to sort of reflect a bit on what marriage is for and what it means, what it can and cannot do, good and bad, for us as individuals, as families, and as a society. And so I'm going to go first to our first invited expert, Andrew G. Marshall, who is a marital therapist. He's an author of many books and a podcast host too. And he joins us from Berlin. Thanks very much for being here, Andrew. Even before the pandemic happened, I just wonder, from the work that you do with people who come to you for therapy and the way that you've thought about this in the books that you've written, is it getting harder to stay together, do you think?
I don't think that these things change very quickly. I think that marriage is always a challenge if you have the expectation that it's going to solve a whole set of problems. If you look at it as a journey of self-discovery, learning about yourself, and through learning about and really actually getting to know somebody else, and them actually holding up a mirror to you constantly, is a way you're going to learn a huge amount about yourself. Sometimes we don't like what we learn. Sometimes it's easier to come up with a long list of what your partner can change and a very short list of what you can change. But I think people are far more interested in relationships than they ever were beforehand, and they're prepared to work much harder. And there's help if they do want to change. So I'm generally optimistic about marriage and relationships.
Andrew, I'm very susceptible, in spite of my own experiences, to the lovely story of that wonderful couple who've been together for 60 years, and they have their picture in the local paper, and they say, what's your advice for a strong marriage? And they always say, give and take, and don't go to bed on an argument. And it's a lovely and romantic and attractive thing. I'm very attracted to the idea of particularly famous people who are married for a long time, David Bowie and mine. You sort of think, wow, they're really making a go of it, and what must be quite challenging situations. But being together for 60 years is not the same as being happy together for 60 years. I just wonder, do you think people do have unrealistic expectations of what being married is going to be like?
Well, the biggest problem we have in our society is something called soul partners. that we're going to meet somebody who we're going to click on such a deep level that all problems are going to float away because we are made for each other. And if you have those sort of kind of fantasies that marriage is going to be the answer, it generally tends to be a little bit of a disaster. So if we could change one, if I could go to my grave with one thing achieved, if it said on my grave, this is the man who killed the idea of soul partners, I would be a very happy man. Unfortunately, the Disney institution is fighting me every inch of the way. So I'm not really expecting to achieve that, but I'm doing my small little contribution here today.
I think that's a really good point, and I didn't frame it actually as the Disney contribution, but a similar thing. I think the sort of the wedding industry, the wedding fetish, is a hugely damaging, I think, and very potent sort of cultural trope. That, by the way, I like watching Say Yes to the Dress as much as the next person. I'm not above a bit of trash wedding TV, but I think that this sort of setting up of achieving wedding as the sort of life goal, I think it particularly affects young women, I think, is, I think, very damaging. And I wonder, there's two elements of this promise that I'd like to unpick a little bit this evening. One is wedding goal, the wedding, the moment. And then the other one is the contractual aspect of it. And I wonder, Andrew, if a sort of contractual legal arrangement, is that a psychologically healthy way to embark on a sort of committed romantic relationship with someone, in your view?
Well, I was a little bit of a skeptic about what difference it made getting married before I got married. I always thought that living together was a personal relationship and marriage was a public relationship. And when I actually did it, I did find out just how different it was, because you suddenly get the rest of your family joining in with this. It becomes very public, and I think that's quite good, the idea of everybody supporting you and everybody being behind you. It certainly makes it much easier. For example, when I moved to Berlin, the fact that we were married, the state actually facilitates everything. So I think it is important.
So Andrew, just so I understand the point, when you moved to Berlin and you were married, the state facilitated the move?
Yes, so they didn't facilitate the move, but once you wanted to go into for example, I wanted to go into the German health system, the fact that I'm married immediately opened the door in the way that if we'd been living together, it wouldn't have done. I could give, 1,001 other examples of that.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Well, I will come back to you. I'm going to come now, I think, to Alison. Alison has joined us from Edinburgh. Alison Edmondson. Now, you're a partner at SKO and you're a family law specialist, and you do a lot of work with people who are sadly at the other end. The white dress bit is long gone, and they're coming to you because it's over, basically. And I know that you are trained to practice collaborative law, which is meant to be a sort of softer way of doing it. It's meant to be a sort of, it's not spiky letters that go from one set of solicitors to the other, but people get round a table and you have to nut it out. I mean, I did collaborative law for my divorce. It's not a really thrilling, lovely way to spend an afternoon, but I think probably it is a more, as it says, collaborative way of trying to do it. As a divorce lawyer, do you still believe in marriage? I wonder if we can get Alison to unmute.
I do, and I when I got married, I worked in a team of, let's say, 8 divorce lawyers, and 5 or 6 of us got married within 18 months of each other. Right. So practice as a divorce lawyer doesn't in any way rob you of your own romantic aspirations. I would say we see people divorcing for just such a variety of reasons, and there's a lot of talk in the press at the moment of divorce lawyers saying, rates are up or inquiries are up or whatever. the tone of which I don't always like, to have to say, because for each couple it will be quite a different story, and for each couple it's quite a painful story, and I find it quite difficult sometimes to talk about it as in terms of trends and an overall perspective, as if it's a national phenomenon rather than a personal story. What we are seeing at the minute actually isn't a massive uptick in inquiries. Relationships are breaking down for different reasons. So we have definitely seen domestic abuse rates up, and there are more cases where my role feels very protective. There are, I would say, personally, I don't know if my colleagues would agree with this, but I've seen far fewer cases where couples have almost formed separate lives because they're working apart. So particularly, this is a very Edinburgh perspective, but a lot of people in Edinburgh, one of the spouses will work part of the week in London. And that puts a lot of strain on a relationship. I haven't seen any of them in 18 months. Whereas we are seeing ones where things have got very intense. So I don't know if it's the case that more couples are splitting up post-pandemic, or if it is the case that different people are splitting up because their stories are differently affected.
Interesting. I don't want to spend all of our hour talking about divorce when we're meant to be talking about marriage, but Alison, I did want to put something to you, somebody who's been through it. I know there'll be other people in the room who've been through it too. When I first started at Tortoise, one of the first meetings I ever went to, strangely, it was a sort of ideas meeting we were having. Theresa May's government at the time had announced that day that they were going to put in place provision so that you could file for divorce within 6 months without having to cite unreasonable behaviour or adultery. So you wouldn't have to do the 2 years with consent. You could get divorced faster without having to go through the nasty process of pointing the finger at the other person. Don't think that has come into law yet. I don't believe it has. Probably COVID or Brexit or something put the kibosh on it or kicked the can down the road. I think I'm right in saying it hasn't happened. But there was quite a spicy discussion between myself and another person who worked at Tortoise who was younger than me and a committed Christian. And she felt that was a terrible thing. And why would we be making it easier for people to give up and walk out on their commitment that they'd made to their partner, to their family, that the promise they'd made to God and what have you. And the feeling I had at the time, just beginning the divorce process, is very not easy at all. It's incredibly difficult. It's very painful. You might say brutal, even though I opted for a collaborative process, which is meant to be gentler on everybody. Do you think that the process of divorce is needlessly painful, or do you think it's appropriately painful, if that makes sense?
Sure, it makes perfect sense. So the short answer is it is needlessly painful. And I say that because people don't give up on their marriages easily. I have never yet had a first meeting with anybody who has come in lightly to have a conversation with me. And for many people, by the time they get as far as even a first conversation with someone like me, we are at the end of 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of heart searching, soul searching, or there's been an absolute crisis and they've discovered something that has torn their world apart. It's very unusual to have somebody just sort of pop in and, people don't end their marriage on a whim. So the point at which the difficult decisions are being made, the point at which marriages become irretrievable, is often before people have engaged with the legal system. And the conversation is much more about emotion, faith, psychology. It's got far less to do with the actual process. The process of sorting out the paperwork can support people to heal or not. And it has never influenced anybody I've come across in the last 20 years to stay in their marriage or not stay in their marriage. So I don't think that the nuts and bolts of the procedure affect people's decision making. And I don't even have any anecdotal evidence of any instance that would support that. What we do know is that a system that forces people to apportion blame and to write down in black upon white all the things that they think their partner did to justify the end of the relationship and then send that to them, and to make that public, and for that to go through, it's the kind of Owens v. Owens situation that was very public a couple of years ago, that does damage to the individuals in the process. At a point when the relationship is already irretrievable, and often all the finances have been sorted out, the arrangements for the children have been sorted out, and it's just, is the state condoning, sanctioning, or even insisting on these people doing further damage to each other or not?
Interesting. Thanks ever so much, Alison. I'm sure we'll come back to you. I'm going to come next to Frank, if I can. Frank Young. And Frank, you were formerly the head of family policy at the Centre for Social Justice. And the Centre for Social Justice, although I know you weren't a co-author of it, you sort of know the ins and outs of the report that was published quite recently, I think last year. And the name of the report was Family Structure Still Matters, which gives people a sense of the content of that report and the perspective it was coming from. The founding belief of it, I read it today, is that staying together is better, and that marriage specifically is better than cohabiting. And when I say marriage, it includes, I mean, including civil partnership, a committed, legally committed relationship is better than cohabiting. Why?
So I think firstly, we would be very careful not to use phrases like better, for example, this being a sort of desperately sensitive area. I think the motivation behind the report was really an imbalance in our political conversation around family, where there is a lot of discussion around relationship quality, but almost zero discussion in our political world and our policy world on family structure, and that is to say, marriage versus other family structures. We saw that last week, for example, where the Secretary of State for Education, who is now the lead minister in government for family, gave a speech talking about family and managed to spend his entire hour talking about family without one reference to marriage, which I thought was extraordinary. I mean, to answer your question directly, the reason we wanted to write the report, which basically we see in the data, that marriage tends to be in a more stable relationship than not being married. So, for example, 90% of parents who are still together when their children are 15 are married, are still married. Take cohabitees, they make up about 19% of couples with children, but account for more than half of family breakdown. So really, it's about the stability that is found in people coming together, making their marriage vows and the commitment found in marriage.
I'm interested to hear you say that you'd be very careful not to use a word like better because this is a sensitive area. Noted. The report, it lists all the many ways that marriage specifically does lead to better outcomes actually for children, for earnings. It even says that marriages are less likely to be abusive, physically abusive, than cohabiting relationships. So it draws a lot of not causative but correlative data. But it also very clearly says, in fact, it's sort of one of the first things it says, that marriage is a middle class secret, and talks about how it is poorer families who tend to cohabit rather than be married, and that cohabiting families have a greater tendency to break down, and that children from households where the relationship between mum and dad has broken down have worse outcomes. And your clear conclusion is that the worsened outcomes for those children is due to significantly worse, abuse of themselves, poor educational attainment, even criminality, really much worse outcomes. The conclusion of the report is very clear that is due to the absence of the marriage, not to the pre-existence of the poverty.
Well, yes. So I think what we see is both, really, that instability and separation drives poverty. So it more than doubles the likelihood of a couple living in poverty. But of course, that poverty itself and the absence of money will make life much harder on a couple. So I think it's possible for both things to be true. And you're right that the report was very clear that it's that stability in a relationship that when we see, which we see in married couples, which do tend towards middle class couples. So there's a very stark, in this country as in other other European countries in particular, marriage gap where the middle classes enthusiastically get married and generally stay married, and then people on lower incomes tend not to be married. That is that stability that then leads to improved outcomes. And you're right on, I mean, ultimately on the point of causation versus correlation, that we can't, for example, take a group of people and put them on Mars and measure their outcomes. But there is clear correlation between those family relationships and then other social outcomes, particularly poverty.
You do talk about this in the report as well, which is that those people, by which I think you mean people in the upper echelons of society, in government or what have you, who may have come from, who may be a middle class background or certainly doing well now, tend to be enjoying the spoils, if you like, of that stable married life that you paint the picture of, not wanting to talk about this for fear of offending people. But then you go on, I couldn't help but, and I sort of admit my own confirmation bias in this reading of the report, Frank, I must confess, but I was detecting some pretty profound gender biases in the analysis of the data in the report, in that when you talk about the benefit of marriage on earning, you only talk about men's earnings. When you refer to single parents in the report, I'm saying you as in the centre, not yourself, it's routinely single mothers that you're talking about. When you talk about the impact on children, the default position is the mother's behaviour and the mother's experience, not the father's. And one mind-boggling sentence is, single mothers seem more willing to make the commitment of marriage to men who offer the greatest potential to economically support their family. And I just felt like there was a sort of undercurrent of a desire to reinforce traditional gender roles in this frame of mum, dad, 2 kids, white picket fence and a dog, that I just couldn't help but bristle when I detected a sort of ideological thrust to the analysis. I don't know if you would recognise that criticism, or you think I'm just bringing my own right-on mindset to the read of it.
I don't recognise it as a sort of right-on mindset. It certainly wasn't intentional, if that's your sort of reading of the subtext of the report. It was designed really to be a statistical analysis of family structures, and then what we can infer from outcomes. And in terms of single parenthood, it is a long established fact that about 90% of single parents are single mothers. Only 10% of single parents are single fathers with a child. So there is an overwhelming gender bias in regards to single parenthood. But you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that I don't necessarily recognise the criticism within the report.
It's definitely worth reading. If we've got the link to it in the chat, I think I'd be interested to know if other people respond to it in the way I did. I'm going to bring in a couple of comments from people who've been active in the chat now before we go to our fourth invited expert. I'm not sure if it's John or Andrea Taylor Cummings, because it's both of your names, John and Andrea. I wonder if you wanted to come away in on this point about the easiness or otherwise of getting divorced. Are you there, John and or Andrea Taylor Cummings?
We're both here.
Hi.
Hi there.
Are you married?
We are indeed, yes.
Congratulations.
Yes, we understood the hesitation around the no-fault divorce, especially in the Christian community, because on the face of it, it sounds like we are making it easy and not encouraging people to fight for something that could be good for them. Start the video, you can do that. But we realized that, especially through talking with people who were involved in putting it together, there we are.
This side.
Would have put my lipstick on if I knew I was going to be on camera. But we realized that the heartbeat of the no-fault divorce is to encourage people, if they're at the point of parting, to part well, and to salvage whatever's left of the relationship, especially if co-parenting is something that they'll have to do in the future, because usually it's the children that suffer through the process. So to be able to do that, to part and part well, you know, we had great conversations with Sir Paul Coleridge, who was a part of the initiative to have the no-fault divorce and understood the intent. And that was, you know, that landed really well with us, because our particular interest is in getting people, companies, the nation to become more proactive about learning to do relationships, knowing that all relationships will face hurdles. So learning to do relationships well up front before we hit the hurdles has to be the most sensible thing, rather than waiting until everything falls over and trying to clean up the mess in the best possible way. What if we got ahead of all of that?
I would say, just if I could jump for a second, jump in there.
Oh.
Up to Andrew's point about, you know, soul partners. What's that about? that is Disney and Cloud Cuckoo Land. The reality is, we go into relationships, we come across people who we think of this at the start of the relationship. Yeah, this is all going to go great. We all are going to hit those hurdles at some point. All relationships will face the hurdles. They'll hit the challenges. And when the wheels start to come off, if you're not equipped to get over those hurdles, you're gonna experience all manner of trouble. So this isn't about finding a soul partner where you get to the finish line, you know,
with no investment of time or effort.
No, it doesn't work like that. And basically, once you find somebody where there are lots of things that are aligned, some sort of values and principles are in place, then you've got something to work with. We're all living, breathing, opinionated human beings. You come across somebody with a different point, at some point you're going to come across conflict. It's about being able to address some of those challenges to get to the finish line successfully.
Yeah. John and Andrea, just forgive me for asking, but is this your line of work? You help people with relationships, or are you just really wise?
Oh boy, what a setup. We'll have to answer that then. Through our own pain early in our marriage, so we've been married 28 years now. In our second year of marriage, we had this wonderful idea that we loved each other so well and we had some business experience, let's start a business together. And then we discovered just how very different we were, and what was an easygoing relationship became very difficult. It was a make or break for the marriage, for the business, for our finances. And through what we learned that helped rescue us then has become a passion of ours. Firstly, we asked, why wasn't this easily available for everybody to just understand how to work with differences and build stronger relationships? So we've been working with it for the last 25 years, but 5 years ago, started
25 years, evenings and weekends.
Evenings
4 or
and
5 years
weekends.
ago, made this the main thing.
Yeah.
Just to try and get the
that's
message
what we
out there.
do.
Proactivity or intentionality is what it's about.
Yeah.
We can all learn to relate to people better, but we just got to be equipped. We've got to have the skills to do that and do it well.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's lovely to talk to you. I might try and go to now, and forgive me, I'm not quite sure I'm going to pronounce your name correctly. Is it Meditase? I'm not sure how to say your name. Medis something. Are you there?
Yeah, sorry, that's actually just the account that I.
Oh, is it? I was going to say it's a very unusual name. I don't know how to address you at all.
Yeah, so this is Ritesh actually, and I was just saying that maybe we're just focusing on a symptom of the problem, and the problem really being that we stopped having all the support that we used to have before, and we are just in the interregnum where we don't have the support, and we haven't quite figured out how to actually get on with each other, and we're just in this period where we're just fumbling around, and the divorces are just a symptom of this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly what we're hearing is that people need help to get through a marriage. And sometimes they do that funny thing in a wedding where all the people in the crowd have to go, "We will help you," or something. Do you remember that thing? You have to shout out, "Yes, we'll help you." I can't remember what the thing is. I'm not quite sure it finishes, just at that bit before you all go through and have your roast beef dinner or whatever it is you do in the reception. Thank you very much. Nice to hear from you. I'm sorry I addressed you by your company name. That's so odd. I might come to Rosie now because I can see she's arrived and she's an invited expert. Well, I don't know if I can call you an expert. You're a sort of an accidental expert, Rosie.
You could say that. I'm a comedian who's been exploring relationships for many years for the purposes of comedy, but actually along the way I have interviewed many academics, and I've read many academic books about relationships and the psychology of love, and have ended up learning a great deal about how relationships work, and have decided to, along with making people laugh and entertaining them and writing books and creating podcasts, actually sort of spreading a message of let's try and communicate and have healthier, more compassionate and ethical relationships if we can.
So you've sort of done, I don't know if they quite work as a series, your book, but the one you wrote before the one you've just written, we'll come and talk about the new one in a minute.
Yeah.
Is monogamy dead?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, marriage is a particular type of monogamy.
Yes.
Just the short answer, is monogamy dead?
I don't think so, but I think we need to have the discussion and ask the question. I did a survey for that show asking what counts as cheating, and actually the answer was much more nuanced than we might think. For many people, it's not just what their partner does in the physical realm. It might be something on an emotional spectrum of what their partner feels, whether they fall in love with somebody else, whether they're thinking about somebody else, or communicating secretly with somebody else that perhaps they tell things to that they don't tell to their partner. So I think these complicated questions are more nuanced than we actually think. We think these questions are very black and white, but they're not. I think in general we have adapted our meaning of monogamy from the original Greek monos gamos, meaning one marriage for life, to meaning sort of one marriage at a time, and we are more serially monogamous as we live longer lives. But yeah, I was very interested in looking at the sort of conundrum of monogamy, because I believe that we're not particularly well wired for it. And how do we sort of navigate that if we want to be monogamous, in fact, because of course some people are consensually and ethically non-monogamous. And now we hear more about different types of relationship structures and how common they are in certain parts of the world. We're just fixated in the Western world on this idea of monogamy and a sort of patriarchal construct, really, of kind of protecting paternity and so on. So it's interesting how we have these structures, and we sort of don't always question where they've come from. And sometimes I think it's a good idea to do that, and then perhaps you can choose monogamy or your form of it in a more conscious way than just sort of having this assumption that you're monogamous, but actually never discussing with your partner what it means.
Yeah, indeed. And now your new book is about sort of celebrating heartbreak, if I can frame it in those terms, and sort of what can you learn? Now, clearly, when it all goes terribly wrong, and either a marriage comes to an end or a very significant relationship comes to an end, there's a learning process, there's a healing process, there's a grieving process, there's an angry, getting drunk and singing all by myself process to be gone through. And I think, and that's all good and that's fine. But you've tried to write a book which is trying to say, be grateful, be thankful, nourish and cherish the terror of the heartbreak scenario.
Yes, to some extent. My book is called The Breakup Monologues, and it's based on a podcast that I've been presenting for the past couple of years or so. And I do explore the sort of positive, transformative side of a breakup, where we can sometimes reinvent ourselves and go on exciting new adventures, and we have more time and headspace for self-reflection and self-discovery. And I think particularly if you have negotiated and brokered a conscious uncoupling or an ethical type of breakup, I think that can be a healthy time in your life when you are single again, and you can do the work to decide who you need to be in another relationship in the future that you hope will last longer. So I think, you know, there's a lot to be learned from breakups, and certainly I've had a few. And this panel is quite interesting for me because as a gay woman, this is the first relationship that I've ever had, which I got into in my mid-40s, where getting married has been a real possibility. I was a student on a same-sex wedding demo outside York Minster on Valentine's Day in 1990. We were standing shouting through megaphones, "Love is not a crime," while two women got married and two men got married in a sort of spoof kind of ceremony that we staged as a little demo in partnership with a local activist group called York Outrage. And we just thought it was science fiction. We just thought, no way in our lifetimes would gay people be able to get married. And it is incredible, really, that we have come so far. And I've had very mixed feelings about marriage over the years, because I suppose I have celebrated a sort of alternative life outside of that traditional narrative. And I think sometimes the LGBTQ community have come up with some interesting and creative solutions to the sort of structures about how we view family and friendship. And the gay community have historically sort of had this idea of considering friends as family and actually looking at different types of family beyond sort of biological. The writer Armistead Maupin uses the term logical family, and we really celebrate community, which I think we've all had to do in, I think, recent times. We've all sort of got to know our neighbours a bit more. But I've always rather liked that sense of community rather than sort of kind of focusing so much on capitalist nuclear family structures. I do think we can be kind and compassionate and loving, but not necessarily in the ways we're told that we have to do it. There seem to be certain narratives about how we're supposed to do these things, but I think there are lots of ways that we can do things. And if we are human and ethical and compassionate, some of the ways that would be deemed alternative and immoral and wrong are often actually equally kind and compassionate and loving and ethical. So, for example, the people that I've met who are in open relationships tend to have a really, really healthy communication with their primary partner, because you have to if you are negotiating boundaries and what everybody feels comfortable with. So I think it's interesting.
Thank you, Rose. I'm sorry to interrupt. You've raised no, please don't apologise. A ton of interesting questions. I might just come back to Andrew, because it's made me wonder aloud about something. One of the processes that I certainly went through in sort of coming to the end of my marriage and making those decisions and then starting the process is there's a really profound tension between responsibility, personal responsibility for my children, for my ex-husband, for the family scenario, for the finances. I was the main breadwinner, and for the promise that I had made. I had made a promise that I absolutely intended to keep, and then the responsibility to myself to be okay, and those two things couldn't go together, and it was a really, really profound and difficult kind of balancing act. And I wonder if that sort of private thing that happens inside anybody who is deciding to leave a marriage where there isn't something really terrible happening, when you just can't make it work, and the sort of you kind of ladder it up to the societal thing, and people see a conflict between taking responsibility for everybody working together as a community and staying together and for the greater good versus individual satisfaction and happiness. And I wonder if there's a sort of unhelpful shadowing of that, because inside your own relationship you feel it very profoundly and then you make a call, but it's not quite the same as you add up all those decisions and conclude, look at all these people walking out on their families, nobody cares about community anymore. But I do think that those things play into the mindset, and certainly the guilt that I will have for the rest of my life about what I did.
It seems very sad that you're going to feel guilty about it, because if you've been communicating with your partner that you're taking your time so that he really understands why you've got to this point, and that actually it's not quite so personal as it feels at the time. And the two of you are looking after your children, and you're talking to your children about it, and that you're holding all the things that you've been talking about so beautifully together. I think that that sounds really healthy and really good. It's the being able to talk honestly, being able to listen to each other and taking your time. Because I think often what happens in situations like the one you've been talking about, if people are facilitated to talk together, they reach the point where they agree together that this is possibly the best way going forward. They can actually put together something that's going to be really supportive for the children and each other going forward. It's a bit like Rosie was talking about, the sort of the logical family, that you're still a family, it's just a slightly different kind of family if you can all cooperate and work together. It can be that your new partner will be an asset for your children too. It could, there are all sorts of ways that you don't actually need to feel guilty if you have kept talking, you've been honest, and you've kept listening to the other person and the other people, the children, your partner, your new partners. If you've got relationship skills, and I think that's what we're talking about, teaching relationship skills, I see no reason why you should be guilty. I think you could possibly have taught your children some really important lessons that you try, but you don't torture each other by sticking together when it's not actually working.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you all for coming to my post-marriage therapy session. I'm tempted, if I may, if he doesn't mind, to bring in Paul Butler. I can see him sitting thoughtfully, resplendent in his purple shirt, which is not solely a fashion choice, I think, Paul. You've made a couple of comments in the chat, and you're a man of the church. In fact, I think you might be a bishop. Am I right?
Yes, I'm the Bishop of Durham, and I speak on marriage matters in the House of Lords for the bishops.
So thank you for being here this evening.
Pleasure. It's been a fascinating conversation, actually.
What are you making of all this? You come at this from a very particular perspective. Just tell us where you're at.
A whole range of things. So I've been married for 38 years to my wife Rosemary, and we have four grown-up children. And absolutely, I hold still to a Christian conviction about marriage. The church continues to wrestle with how we respond appropriately to same-sex marriage and so on. We're still working on that. But I would endorse everything that's been said about the fact that marriage is about long-term relationship, and it has to be worked at. It goes through phases, it goes through changes. And if you don't work at them when they change, I'll give an example. When the last of our children left home for Rosemary and I, that was a huge change, because you've invested so much time and energy into raising children that there's a danger that your relationship has become totally focused on that. So you have to rethink it and reimagine it again. But one of the factors I don't hear discussed often enough is, this may not be entirely accurate, but the average length of a marriage in the 1840s was around 11 to 12 years. The average length of marriage now is around 11 to 12 years. And because the main reason in the 1840s was because people didn't live very long. And one of the issues that I think we've probably not wrestled with enough is the length of life that we now live, and all the changes that we go through life, which is one of the reasons why we end up in serial monogamy rather than necessarily a lifelong partner. So but yeah, thank you, and thanks for calling me in.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure, and great to be in such a.
If I could I do one little advert?
Yeah, do.
If I may, while I'm on. The archbishops have actually have asked me to co-chair a commission on families and households with Professor Janet Walker, where we're not going to report till November next year. And genuinely, I would love to hear from folk on the call, because it's about what's best for families and households in life. So not specifically marriage, it's about family life, about household life. And if anyone wants to send us thoughts, we would welcome them, because we want to hear from all walks of life.
Thanks very much. Honestly, you get these senior Church of England people on, and the next thing you know, they're pitching their latest scheme. You can't trust them as far as you can. Thank you so much. Lovely to speak to you, Paul. Let's bring in a couple more people who are active in the chat. I saw some back and forth between, I think, mainly younger colleagues actually of mine, talking about would they change their surname and if they would, or if they wouldn't. Gabby, you've been chatting away. Gabby's a colleague of mine at Tortoise. I can see your husband in the background. I think it's your husband, so careful what you say.
It is indeed. No, my lovely husband. Yeah, I suppose I had a few thoughts. So we're, well, relatively recently married, I suppose. We'll have been married 3 years this summer, but we've been together for 12, is it, Fred? I'll check. 2009. Yeah, we got together in 2009. So we were in a relationship and sort of living together and very close for a long time before we got married. I was never going to change my name because it's so much part of my personality. And I think we really enjoyed being able to just pick and choose. You know, neither of us are religious, and our families are, well, Fred's family is mildly religious, but, you know, not super strict, and certainly didn't impose anything on us. So we were really fortunate in that we were able to pick and choose the parts of sort of traditional marriage and kind of modern relationships to sort of celebrate our relationship with our family and friends. And it was, yeah, amazing. I never thought I'd be into sort of a traditional marriage, but yeah, I'm happy to.
Did you change your name to your husband's name? Is
No.
this his name? That's your original name from before?
Yeah. So, but kind of the sort of interesting element to that is that when I was growing up, so my mum and dad were never married. My dad wasn't around when I was growing up, but my mum gave me my dad's name, and we're sort of estranged now, and we have been for years. And I always thought when I was growing up that I would want to change my name as soon as I could, and definitely if I got married. But by the time rolled around to getting married, and I was in my early 30s, 31, I could never imagine getting rid of that part of my identity. So you definitely, yeah.
Interesting. Thanks so much. Tessa, are you making the dinner? Can you come on and chat? She's just done a taste.
You know me, always conforming to gender stereotypes. Yeah, what?
So you put that rather lovely thing. You've told it to me before about you and your ex, when the decree absolute came through, you sort of had a bit of an aha moment.
Yeah. My children are in the kitchen scoffing at me. This is very important, girls. Yeah, no, it was really that sort of moment of realization when, you know, you knew you were going to be divorced now forever, and we have children, and you sort of just need to put things to bed. And I thought, I'm a great believer in walking and talking, and I just needed to do that for me, and we just need to say all things that needed to be said that weren't said via lawyers and, you know, in snatch conversations on doorsteps. And it was really good. Actually, I'm a big advocate of the walk and the talk. And I think it just drew a line under things and allowed us to sort of move on. And in fact, one of my very wise children described the change in relationship, that's you, Connie, described the change in the relationship in our family between the horizontal change between me and their dad, but the verticals between me and them and me and their dad had stayed the same. And it was just a sort of a slight shift on the axis. And I love that. I thought that was really smart. Anyway, I'm going to stop embarrassing my children now.
Please do go on and make dinner and let them scoff at you in peace. Ellen Halliday, who has been marshalling the chat and did the very brilliant research for us on the data that we showed at the beginning. Ellen, I'm just interested to know, did you find anything surprising when you were doing the research to prepare for this in relation to your own preconceptions about marriage? And maybe if this isn't too much of a sort of personal question, I'm interested to know how you and your pals your age, girls and boys. In general, do you have a sense that marriage is sort of something that you all have put somewhere vaguely as a notion, a sort of a life point that you expect or hope to get to?
Yeah, so on the first point, I think doing the research made me realize I know very little about what marriage versus, you know, a civil partnership actually involves. I was surprised about the differences in grounds for divorce, and you know, I think we were talking about that briefly in the chat about how adultery is grounds for divorce between if it's in a marriage and only when it's heterosexual, which I found just a bit odd.
It is weird, that, isn't it? I didn't know that until
so that was a bit odd. But there's I mean, the thing about marriage and divorce, there's tons of data out there, so I'll put a few more links in the chat to the ONS kind of summaries. People can have a read and see what they find surprising as well. And yeah, in terms of my peer group, so I'm 27, and I'm definitely at the age where people are starting to get engaged. There was, you know, some friends at the weekend. I've got, I think now because of COVID, I've got 5 weddings I've got to go to next year because they've all become backlogged. So people are doing it. I think growing up, I always thought it would be something that I would do. I just assumed, I didn't question it. I then kind of went to university and thought, actually, wait, hang on, I'm a feminist and I don't believe in marriage and whatever. And now I think a lot of us look at it from a more sort of practical point of view. What are the benefits? What are the, you know, so I don't know. I think that in the end, a lot of my peer group will get engaged and will get married. It's hard to say. It was definitely something I was raised to expect to do.
There's a funny moment, which is once somebody is engaged and kind of on the roller coaster, you know, the train has left the station, it's hard in a friendship to ask them why. You just have to sort of be happy for them and let's all go on the hen do and we're going to buy the dress. It's sort of that honesty about the nature of the relationship. Somehow it's hard to penetrate once the deal is nearly done. And I think that's the thing I never really quite played out in my peer group when I was getting married. Why am I doing this? It's quite a hard question to answer, but it's a very important one to ask. Do you feel the same?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I feel like it's a thing people are doing because it feels like the thing that you do
the next thing
when you're about to turn 30, that you get engaged and you get married. And you know, I have a lot of examples of great marriages in my life. You know, my parents, my brother's very happily married and so on. So I think it's very easy to just think, okay, well, I'll do that too, without really questioning it. And I guess from the conversations that we've had today about openness and honesty and kind of really thinking through why you're doing this would probably be a good idea. We should probably learn to do that.
Interesting. Thank you so much. I'll go to Fliss and then I'm going to go to Edmund Davidson. Fliss, are you okay to come on? I'm just conscious that there's this question about, in Frank's work, it was very much about contrasting married relationships with cohabiting relationships. And some people have mentioned that when you get married, it feels different somehow. And it's very hard to know why that is, but it sort of is. That was your experience too, you were saying?
Yeah, definitely. So I knew as soon as I met Mehmet that I was going to marry him because of how he lived his life. So he was a fighter, I'm a fighter. And I knew that I needed that kind of person. And yes, there was the romance and everything else, but those, you know, I think by the time you get sort of past 30, you realize that there are certain types of people that you get along with, and it was important that criteria was there. I mean, we basically, we didn't do the whole romantic engagement thing. We were actually at a party and there was another married couple having an argument. We were sitting in the corner laughing, thinking, oh, God, we could totally do a better job than that. And it was kind of like, oh, well, let's just get married then. And it wasn't, it was more of a practical thing. But the moment that we decided that we were getting married, and then obviously once we'd had the wedding, it did just feel different. It felt like there was this security there that, you know, I mean, you're never going to stop somebody from cheating. You're never going to stop somebody from changing the way that they are. And I definitely think that that is a thing that a lot of definitely my friends need to. You can't go into a marriage or a serious relationship thinking that, oh, I don't really like that bit, but I can change it. Definitely not. You have to accept everything. But yeah, I think, I don't know, the other thing that I was going to say, Liz, was about there have been things in the chat about, you know, how you're brought up and your how your parents' relationships were. And that was one thing that I observed, that my parents were engaged after 12 weeks of being together. Then their firstborn child was born with brain damage, then got leukemia when she was 2. Then I came along, you know, then they lost the business. And it was just, I just observed this series of sort of major issues and how they had to work really hard together to get through for the family. So I knew that, I mean, everybody knows the journey that I've just gone through in the past 2 years, and it absolutely tested my marriage.
Yeah.
But I believe that even though it was extremely difficult at times, I chose the right person, I chose the right partner, and having that marriage certificate just gave us that extra bit of security that if he did, I mean, there was a point where my parents told me to get divorced from my husband during my treatment.
Gosh.
And yeah, I mean, it's just, if you can imagine that what you would have to have gone through,
that's really,
you know, I mean, you know, but it's, for me, it's just that security.
Well, I can see him back there with the cat, so I'm happy that you didn't press.
He's just had to turn the TV up.
I'm just conscious we're almost out of time. I'm going to quickly come to Ed because I want to get the sort of the male perspective. You're a sort of peer of Ellen's, really. Ed, what's your peer group? Where are you at in your career? And what are attitudes to marriage like?
So yeah, I'd agree with what Ellen said. It is almost a bit of a default, and most people go down that road. It's odd in a sort of generally, hopefully more rational world that there is an expectation that if you've been in a relationship and you're around the age of 30, you go for marriage and then you have kids, and it kind of comes in that order, or you at least try to go down that road. And whether that's society or your parents or whatever, that still seems to be the default. But I also agree with Ellen, if people who haven't been, who have not got engaged and aren't going to go down that road, it's completely normal. It's not really questioned, and that's just their decision, and that's probably kind of more and more common. I actually got engaged over the weekend.
Ed!
Yeah. So I'm obviously pro.
Congrats. Well, I hope we haven't put you off.
It was exactly the kind of event I wanted to come to 3 days after getting engaged. But
that's well, how lovely. What's a lovely way to end. I'm going to just slightly bum everybody out now by the end after we've just had Ed's happy news, but I was just going to say there have been some very profound and I think helpful things that people have said this evening. I want to thank everybody very much for joining in gamely and with vulnerability and honesty and wisdom. I think that we're all, I think, in agreement that we're going to have to somehow shake off our addiction to the very seductive idea that everybody has a soulmate and what you need to do is find the one, and there's one shining glorious person somewhere waiting for you on the top of a mountain, or more likely on Tinder, and you must find them and stick with them forever. I don't think that helps anybody. I was very interested in what people have been saying about the need to learn relationship skills, that there's a sort of muscle memory. We heard from John and Andrea about this idea that getting good at doing a relationship rather than just sort of passively being in one is something that we could all do with practicing a little bit. I think that's interesting. I was weirdly validated when Alison gave me such an emphatic answer to my question to say, yes, the process of divorce is needlessly painful. And I think she's really right in that the real pain and hard work has already happened by the time you pick up the phone to the solicitor. And I very much hope that fault-free divorce, a more painless and probably less expensive fault-free divorce will be forthcoming. I think that this concept of the logical family is very interesting. We have focused a little bit on heterosexual relationships, but marriage is for everybody. And I think this idea of a logical family that you get to choose and people you can surround yourself with, understanding different ways of making long-term stable relationships work. What struck me very much about Frank's report from the Centre for Social Justice was that the preference for marriage was all viewed through this lens of stability. It's the stability that you need, and that's what kind of pays dividends. And it just at the moment, the marriage is the proxy for that. I think there are lots of ways that we can build stability and love and compassion and empathy into our lives, and we just have to work harder to do that. I do wish somebody had asked me why I was getting married when I made that decision and hadn't been so respectful of my joyous kind of romantic mindset. And I think we can all do each other a favour at asking why, because as Sian Wood had compellingly made the point in the chat, if you choose not to, people don't think twice about asking you why, particularly if you're a woman. So why are you doing this is a really helpful question, I think, because there are material benefits of security, of stability, of status, still even financial benefits, but those aren't good reasons to be embarking on this kind of journey. So thank you very much to everybody. In conclusion, I don't think the end of marriage is nigh at all. I don't think the Bezoses or the Gateses are anything to do with it. Much as I wish them well, and I hope they have a happy divorce and look after their children and everything else. But thank you very much for engaging the conversation. Particular thank you, of course, to Andrew, to Rosie, to Frank, and to Alison, and to everybody who has contributed. Have a lovely rest of the evening. I am going to have a consolatory, divorced lesbian glass of rosé. I hope you all do. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye.